In a small room adorned with yellow floral wallpaper, two figures stood. One was Mrs. Pickles, a short woman with gray hair and stern facial features, including an eagle nose and thin lips. She wore a coarse, heavy necklace that bounced with every sharp and whip-smart word she uttered. "Frank, do you realize that we can't live like this anymore?" Mrs. Pickles raised her head, her voice cutting through the room. "She's in our way." The man looked at his mother with a mix of defiance and guilt. His soft facial features became pitiful, his hands flailed helplessly, and his eyes avoided his mother's gaze. "But Mom, Janice is my wife." Mrs. Pickles spread her hands apart and snorted. "Oh, come on, you wouldn't have another woman if you cared for her, and I'm not going to clean up after her. She's like a vegetable, and you heard what the doctor said. She won't live more than a year, so what's the point? I think she'll be fine at her grandmother's house. There, she'll remember her homeland and her childhood. One good thing is that you will have a decent inheritance when she dies. That could improve our situation." Frank looked thoughtfully at his mother and sighed. The next day, all the bags and suitcases with Janice's belongings were ready. Mrs. Pickles put them out into the hallway, grinning at the sight of her confused daughter-in-law. Janice, a petite and pretty girl with blonde hair, sat in a wheelchair. At 27, she had been unexpectedly struck by a stroke, leaving her disabled. Janice had lost not only the ability to move but also to speak. She sat almost constantly in her wheelchair, remaining silent. When Frank was at work, Mrs. Pickles took care of her daughter-in-law. Sometimes it seemed to Janice that her husband deliberately stayed late at work to avoid coming home to the helpless wife who couldn't even go to the restroom by herself. Mrs. Pickles had never really liked her daughter-in-law. Janice's ambitions and desire to achieve a lot bothered her. She believed that Janice should support her husband instead of spending her days on work-related matters. Janice worked as an assistant to the director at a large company but dreamed of having her own business, though she lacked the startup capital. The stroke destroyed any sympathy Mrs. Pickles had for her. If before she had simply annoyed Janice with her nagging, after the incident she constantly shouted at her, did not tolerate Janice's mute requests, and often forgot about her medicine or lunch. The only thing that pleased Mrs. Pickles was that Janice couldn't speak and didn't interfere with her rereading the plays she had once performed in the theater. While Frank struggled to carry the heavy suitcases to the car, Janice sat against the door, staring in mute horror at what was happening. Her eyes were red, and she was on the verge of tears. "Don't worry," Mrs. Pickles grinned. "Your doctor said you have a weak heart, and the air in the village is good. Maybe you'll even live this year. Didn't you ever want to go back to your granny's house in the country?" A multitude of thoughts swarmed in Janice's mind, but she couldn't express any of them. If she could, she would shout at her mother-in-law, expressing everything she thought about that old gray-haired woman. "Frank, dear, what took you so long?" Mrs. Pickles asked her son, who struggled to catch his breath. It was clear that he had a hard time with the heavy bags. "The elevator broke down. I had to carry all the stuff from the 20th floor," Frank explained. Mrs. Pickles shook her head, looking reproachfully at her daughter-in-law. "And I told you we should hire movers," she said reproachfully. "Mom, you know very well we don't have the money for that." "Oh, Sonny, once I used to perform in theaters every day, filling entire halls, and your daddy used to come after lectures to watch me," the woman said dreamily. "Could I have ever imagined that I would have to change diapers?" Mrs. Pickles glanced at her daughter-in-law with disdain and fell silent. Suddenly, the neighbor came out of the building. "Mrs. Pickles, good afternoon." The neighbor nodded. "Are you going somewhere?" Mrs. Pickles smiled broadly. "Hello, we're taking Janice to a boarding house for rehabilitation. The doctor said it should help." "It must be expensive, right?" said the neighbor, shaking her head. "Oh yes, costly," sighed Mrs. Pickles. "But I can't leave my daughter-in-law without treatment. She's done so much for us." The neighbor said something else and went her way. The smile and the pitying expression disappeared from Mrs. Pickles' face. She turned to her son and frowned. "Let's hurry up before the whole entryway finds out about our plans. We should have done it early in the morning." Frank took the suitcase in his hands and snorted. "It was doggone cold in the morning. It's 4 now. Do you want me to freeze all my limbs off? Asked the man, and without waiting for an answer, walked towards the car, leaving his indignant mother behind. Frank was the only and favorite child in the family. Mrs. Pickles and her husband, Michael, had him at a late age. The professor of law at the university and the star of the drama theater put aside their own lives and dedicated themselves to raising their son. The result of such overprotectiveness was a frail Frank who, at almost 40 years old, lived with his mother and worked at a low-paying job where he was bullied by his boss and disliked by his colleagues. 20 minutes later, Janice and all her belongings were finally in the car. Frank put his wife and her folded wheelchair in the back seat. Tears were flowing from the woman's eyes. "Janice, calm down, please," the man whispered quietly, adjusting his belt. "A neighbor will look after you there. We'll pay her out of your money, of course," Mrs. Pickles cut in. Frank shrugged his shoulders and nodded. "We're not very financially sound right now, as you realize, so yes, out of yours. You'll be better off there." Janice looked at her husband with unwavering eyes, trying to see even a shred of pity or unwillingness in his pale face. Unfortunately, there was none. The car pulled away from Frank and Janice's home exactly at noon. Mrs. Pickles waved goodbye and went home to reread her playbook, imagining herself on stage, being greeted by the applause of admiring art connoisseurs. Frank sighed, speeding up. He tried not to look in the rearview mirror, where he could see his wife's puffy eyes. "Janice, you should understand me. I have no other choice." The man could have sworn that his wife raised her eyebrow mockingly. However, when he wiped his glasses, all he saw was her grieving face. "My mom is trying to make things better for us. She's right, I can't look after you all the time. I have a job to do. She's not young anymore, so you'll be better off there. You'll have your own nurse. You'll go back to your grandmother's house, which you often remember fondly." Frank fell silent again, turning away from his wife's gaze, but he could feel it behind him. It seemed to burn through his thin jacket and press directly on his lungs, making him breathe faster. The journey to the village where Janice would have to live was long. The village was remote and almost abandoned, with a couple of streets, a few houses, one store in the center, and an old medical office that had been closed for years due to lack of staff. The dark blue car passed by a small house with an overgrown garden and a dilapidated fence. The house itself was quite decent, at least from the outside. The garden was filled with century-old trees and thick grass that, in some places, was taller than the fence. In front of the window was an old bench, and someone was lying on it. While Frank pulled his wife out of the car and sorted out her wheelchair and belongings, Janice stared unblinkingly at the silhouette lying on the bench next to her long-deceased grandmother's house. She squinted but couldn't make out who it was. From the bench, muttering something, a woman rose and staggered toward the gate. Her face was wrinkled and sagging, her hair tangled, and there was an old bruise under her eye. She was dressed in completely mismatched clothes: a yellow t-shirt, green shorts unsuitable for the weather, and pink, worn-out shoes with rhinestones. You're so early," the woman stammered. Frank frowned and turned to his wife. "This is your nurse, Janice. Let's get acquainted. Her name is P. She will take care of you now." In confirmation of his words, P nodded and staggered a little. Frank unloaded all the suitcases from the car and even carried them into the house. Then he slipped P a thin envelope. There obviously wasn't much in it, but judging by P's expression, it was enough for her. The man stood in front of his wife and sighed. "Janice, why are you so disgruntled? I'm sure you're smiling inside. This is your childhood home." He looked around at the overgrown property and the broken gate. "Fresh air, constant care. What else do you need to be happy?" Janice could think of a million things that would make her happy. However, as usual, she remained silent, glaring angrily at her husband. Each glare carried more thoughts than words could express. Frank understood this and even had a small pang of conscience in his heart, but then his mother's words and the numbers in Janice's bank account came to his mind. This silenced the pang and made him anticipate the taste of his wife's money. Frank got into the car and waved to his wife through the window. P moved closer to her ward and waved to him. "Don't worry, Frank. Everything will be fine." The man forced another strained smile. and the car drove away, leaving Janice alone with an empty, overgrown house and an alcoholic woman who was supposed to take care of her. A year later. Frank, are you serious? You never once checked on your wife. Mrs. Pickles glanced at the calendar and said with horror, A year? Are you a fool, Frank? How do you know if she died a long time ago or even worse, got up from the wheelchair? Frank tore himself away from the television and looked tiredly at his mother. He had just come home from work and casually realized that he had never visited his wife. Mrs. Pickles was shocked and indignant. P calls me every week. Everything is fine there. I give her money every quarter. Calm down, Mom. Mrs. Pickles snorted and walked over to the couch where her son lay. She snatched the remote and turned off the TV. When I talk to you, you must look only at me, Mrs. Pickles said loudly and a bit dramatically. P. Who is she? The same drunk you left to look after your wife? Are you sure she's taking care of Janice and not drinking the money you give her? Maybe she hasn't gone to Janice's in a long time while you're lying here watching TV. Frank rolled his eyes tiredly. Do you want me to go see her tomorrow? Fine. I'll spend my only day off traveling to a backwoods village to see my half-dead wife. Yes, Mom, you really care about me. With a loud snort, Mrs. Pickles threw the TV remote at her son and left the room, muttering all her thoughts about him. The next day, Frank packed a few things in the morning, took an envelope with money, and got into the car. He looked longingly at the clock, which showed only 7 o'clock in the morning. He could still be sleeping, but instead he had to go to that damn village. He considered his mother's fears in vain, but since childhood he was used to obeying her in everything. It was a long journey. The radio was broken, and the silence of the car made the morning even more unpleasant. Frank vaguely remembered the road to the house where Janice lived. He used to give the money to P in the city where she would come by bus to receive the envelope. Frank had been to the village only 3 times. Once when he dropped off his handicapped wife, the second when he had been looking for a car there, and the third when he was dating Janice and she had shown him her childhood house. Unexpectedly, Frank pulled up next to an almost new fence. The grass in the garden had been cut, but had grown back as if it had been done a couple of months ago. Frowning, he got out of the car. Carefully, he opened the gate and called for his wife and P. However, no one answered. Frank wanted to go into the house, but it was locked. He tried to jerk the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, he took out his cell phone and called P but received no answer. Upset, he rubbed his forehead and looked around. Now his mother's suspicions did not seem so useless to him. Despite knowing that P was not trustworthy, Frank still had some level of trust in her. He knew that her house was close to Janice's, so he left the car and walked down the street. In 5 minutes he found the right house. To his dismay, it looked even worse than his wife's house. As he stepped inside, a strong, unpleasant odor hit his nose, causing him to pinch it shut. P was sitting at a huge round table, drinking a yellow-colored drink. Frank quickly took hold of the woman and led her outside. "Where's Janice?" Frank said angrily. "Who?" P asked brazenly and loudly with a slurred tongue. She seemed to stare in front of her and saw nothing. "Where's my wife, you alcoholic drunkard?" "Ah, Janice. She doesn't live far from here." "Show me," Frank demanded. They walked along an empty road for a while, with Frank growing more and more surprised by the house they were approaching. Compared to the rest of the buildings in the village, it was huge with 3 floors, a balcony, and a large garden. Multiple cars and farm equipment were visible in the backyard. P stopped not far from the wrought iron gates of the house and pointed straight ahead. "She lives there now," P nodded and walked away without saying anything else. Frank was shocked by what he saw, but he quickly pulled himself together and rang a small bell. A joyful voice rang out, "Elliot, why are you so early?" Frank was frozen in place for a moment before he asked quietly, "Janice?" The voice on the other side fell silent before responding, "Frank, come in." As the gate swung open, Frank was greeted by a vast garden and a stone path lined with an abundance of flowers. He carefully walked along the path and entered the house. On the steps stood a short, petite woman with blonde hair, dressed in a beige suit and shawl. She looked down at him, her face seemingly expressionless. "I thought you wouldn't show up." Janice grinned, but her tone was inviting. "Come in now that you're here." Frank was speechless as he followed his wife through the house, which was tastefully furnished with pleasant colors, beautiful decorations, paintings, and clean carpets. His gaze remained fixed on Janice, who looked even more beautiful than before the stroke. Her face had a healthy blush, her scarlet lips glistened, and her eyes were subtly highlighted with eyeliner. It was a simple beauty, but Frank had never seen anything like it before. Janice led him into a spacious room with sofas and armchairs. "I'll make some tea, and we can talk," she said, heading to the kitchen. Frank sat down on an armchair, unable to take his eyes off the beauty of the room. He pinched himself to confirm that it was real. He couldn't believe he had expected to see his sick wife in a wheelchair, but instead he was greeted by a radiant version of her he had never seen before. A few minutes later, Janice returned with a large tray carrying several cups of tea. She handed one to Frank and took one for herself, sitting carefully across from him. "Didn't expect this, did you?" she asked quietly. Frank shook his head. "I also didn't expect my beloved husband to send me off to die for money," Janice continued, cutting off his attempted excuses. "Keep your meaningless excuses to yourself. I know everything, darling. You're not excellent at hiding the truth. It's all about my inheritance. When I received the will from my grandmother in Germany, I was ecstatic, imagining the life we could have together. But then I discovered something that changed my mind. Do you remember my friend Krista? We used to work together at the company," Janice asked. Frank nodded. "She's the one who encouraged me to change my life a year and a half ago," Janice said. Tall and statuesque, Christina had been sitting in front of Janice at a cozy restaurant where their boss had sent them for a meeting that had already concluded. "Dinner's on the company, why not indulge?" Janice had grinned, comfortably taking a seat. Then she opened her small purse, took out an envelope, and handed it to her friend. "Take a look at this. Do you think it's really true?" Christina eagerly opened the envelope and read the letter. It was a letter from Germany. "Who is Annie Reuter?" Christina asked. "My grandmother," Janice answered. "My father's mother. She married a German when my father was about 6 or 7, and they went to live there. Then my dad came back here and met my mom. The last time I saw her was when I was a child. I last saw my grandmother at my father's funeral. She suggested I go away with her. And why didn't you say yes?" Christina asked. "I couldn't have left Frank," answered Janice. "He's got a mom here, a job, and I've never dreamed of going abroad." Christina looked at her colleague with incomprehension. "You're incorrigible, Janice. You missed a good chance for an interesting life in Germany because of an ordinary man." Janice rolled her eyes. She knew her friend's position on her husband very well and preferred not to listen to her. Christina had always been very sharp-tongued, which gave her a good career but few friends. They all scattered because of her straightforwardness. "Your Frank would be ready to sell his own mother for money. Do you know how much your grandmother left you?" "There was a letter enclosed," replied Janice. "She wrote that I was her last relative and that she would give part of the inheritance to her husband's children and part to me. Judging from the letter, there is a very respectable sum there and also a share in an estate in Germany. Do you have to go there to get it?" Christina asked. "There are instructions in the letter. I can accept the inheritance here. The notary will come here himself. I can imagine how pleased Frank will be. He has always dreamed of money and his own business. And you've been dreaming too." Christina interrupted her, waving her fork. "Unlike him, you have the skills and brains to lead a business." "Don't say that about Frank. He's a good man. He's just unlucky." Christina burst into laughter. "Yes, and most of all, he's unlucky with his mother. Not a mother-in-law, but a true wretch. I still don't understand why you live with her when you could move out." Janice shrugged. "Mrs. Pickles can't live alone. She's not used to it, and it's not so hard for me to put up with her." Christina grudgingly snorted and sipped her wine. "I don't advise you to talk about the inheritance to your husband." They'll either send you to the grave for that money or start wooing you and taking every penny of it. Janice slapped her palm on the table and looked threateningly at her friend. Frank and I love each other. Nothing like that is going to happen. You have too bad an opinion of my family. Really, Christina grinned but changed the topic. That same evening, Janice came home and shared the news of the inheritance with her family. Everyone was happy. Mrs. Pickles even opened a bottle of expensive wine, and Janice felt that Christina was really wrong. A few weeks later, she walked down the street, smiling at everything around her. Life at home had improved with Mrs. Pickles no longer nagging her and Frank spending more time with her. She decided to stop by a men's clothing store to buy a new tie as a gift for her husband. Janice glanced at the shop window, oblivious to her surroundings, until she turned her head and saw Frank. She was about to call out to him, but suddenly she noticed a girl walking towards him. Frank hugged and kissed her. Janice stumbled backward and leaned on the shop window to steady herself. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Without creating a scene, Janice got home and went to bed early, contemplating what had happened. The next morning, she took the day off from work and went to a local detective agency. A short, thin man with glasses sat at a small table reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. Janice sat across from him and explained the situation. "I want to know everything. How they met, where they sleep, their actions, the places they date. I want to know everything." For a whole week, Janice lived in uncertainty. She didn't dare tell Christina the truth, not wanting to hear her say, "I told you so." But she had to admit Christina was right. It was as if Christina had always seen through Frank. Not wanting their relationship, Christina had refused to be a maid of honor at Janice's wedding, which deeply offended her. Of course, they eventually made up, but Janice still carried the pain in her heart. Only now did she begin to understand her friend, who only wanted the best for her. A week later, Janice got a call from the detective, and soon she was sitting across from him. "You know, you're lucky that your husband's mistress is quite talkative," said the man, grinning. "I had to follow her around for almost a week, interviewing her friends, but I found out everything. Her name is Aisha Selleck. She's 22 years old and a graduate of the pedagogical college. She met your husband a few months ago, I believe, at a coffee shop. Thank you for the information. What about any evidence, like a video or—" The detective, with a broad smile, reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a large antique tape recorder. Janice was genuinely surprised by what she saw. She hadn't seen such a machine since her childhood. It seemed they weren't made anymore. Twisting a knob, the man turned on a recording that was loud and occasionally crackled. "Frank," a high-pitched female voice exclaimed, "this is for me? Oh my goodness, it's beautiful. It must be expensive, right?" "I wouldn't spare any money for you," Frank replied with satisfaction. "Once I start my own business, I will be able to shower you with all sorts of jewelry every day." "But when you interrogated me, you said you didn't have money for your business yet." There were no sounds, but Janice was ready to swear that Frank smiled broadly. "My wife does. She recently inherited from her grandmother. We'll use her money to start a business and make a fortune. You'll leave her, won't you?" Aisha said in an angelic voice. "As soon as she ceases to be necessary for me, yes," Frank said loudly. The recording went on, the man and the girl saying more things, but Janice was no longer listening. She went into her own thoughts, sitting with a perfectly straight back and looking straight ahead. She remembered her acquaintance with her husband and how happy she was when he proposed to her. Janice was 11 years younger than Frank. They met when she was graduating from an economics university. He invited her to a cozy cafe, took her to the park under the stars, and bought tickets to the theater and concerts. Mrs. Pickles seemed very sweet and kind at that time. Janice, who had recently lost her mother, fell in love with the intelligent family and was ready to marry the poor and shy Frank. Christina was against it, but Janice did not listen. She was absorbed in new feelings. Memories arose in the cheated wife's mind of how she and Frank chose his suit for the wedding and how, after the celebration, they sorted out the gifts. At that time, she was insanely happy and was sure that she would always be so happy. Although Frank was not glad about her dream of business and career, Preferring a family and children like his mom, Janice was not ready for this. She wanted more. Now all the dreams and hopes of a mutual life collapsed in one moment. Frank, the same Frank who never raised his voice at her, was planning to use her money to start a business and then leave her. It seemed so wild that Janice sat there looking at the wall for several minutes. The detective was silent. He'd seen worse reactions. Once, a deranged wife had simply smashed his window in a fit of rage at her husband. He got up and went to get some water. Janice drank the water in one smooth motion and then remembered Christina's words that Frank was ready to sell his own mother for money. She hadn't believed her then, but now it seemed true. In the clever head of the deceived wife, a plan began to form. A vicious grin appeared on her face, and the detective recoiled aside. He had never seen such an expression on her face. A few months later, Frank's dark blue car pulled away from the gnarled fence behind which disabled Janice had been left. As soon as the car was out of sight, Janice rose from her wheelchair. P's eyes went wide, watching her ward get up from her wheelchair after her stroke. "P, let's make a deal," Janice said. "I will pay you as much as my husband does, and you will not tell him what you saw." P nodded dazedly, unable to ask questions. "That's fine. We'll be great friends. Here's your first payment." Janice held out some bills. "You'll come back every month, and I'll give you money. In return, you must keep informing my husband that my condition does not change and he does not need to come. Is that clear?" The woman nodded, snatched the bill, and without saying goodbye, walked away. Janice went into the house to change her clothes. Inside, everything was dusty. The furniture was covered with cloth, garbage was everywhere, and one window was broken, probably because children had tried to climb in. Janice walked over to the old red sofa, threw off the fabric, and sat down tiredly. A cloud of dust formed around her. The woman took out her phone, which Mrs. Pickles had miraculously failed to find, and dialed the only number she could trust. "Come. Everything happened exactly as you said. I'm waiting." Pushing the phone aside, Janice lay down. Her head was swarming with thoughts. She thought about everything and nothing at the same time. An hour and a half later, when Janice had already cleaned the house a little, the door opened and Christina walked in. She was holding a small grocery bag. "Wine and takeout to celebrate," grinned Christina. "Good thing you brought wine. I definitely wouldn't have gotten through the day without it. I still can't believe they left me here for dead, and they believed the hastily concocted diagnosis. That's really beyond my mind. They heard I didn't have long to live, and they started rejoicing. Where were they to ponder the reality of the diagnosis named by Dr. Grimes?" Christina and Janice began to eat, pondering what they would do next. "I'll live here for a month or two until I figure out how to move on. I'd have zero plans for the future. For the first time in my life, I have no plans." "What are you going to do here?" Christina asked. "An old abandoned house, an overgrown garden, a remote village. You and such a place are incompatible. If I throw myself headlong into the maelstrom now, I'll have a nervous breakdown," Janice explained. "I'll live here, calm down a little. Besides, I haven't had a vacation in a long time." Christina shrugged her shoulders. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. From the first look, she disliked Frank, not knowing why. She had been stupid to refuse to be a maid of honor at the wedding, and she had joked about him being willing to sell his own mother. To her, Frank seemed like a spineless guy, incapable of doing anything but writing insurance at his insurance company. But he was able to leave his wife to die, and this seemed wild. Christina spent the night at her friend's house, and the next morning she went home. Janice quit her job, but Christina did not because she had no inheritance from a rich grandmother. Janice started the new day with a cold shower to refresh her thought-filled head a little. 3 weeks of living in hell were behind her. She had given her husband a test, hoping to see a little bit of care or love from him, but eventually all she got was hatred and the expectation of a quick death. This was the worst of all. Her habitual life was over. She needed to cheer up. Taking the money out of her suitcase, which Christina had brought to her, the woman went to the store. She vaguely remembered its location and decided to ask the villagers. Because it was early morning and everyone was either at work or at home, autumn brought a coolness to the air, especially in the mornings. Janice wrapped herself in an old coat she had found in the closet, trying to get comfortable. She managed to find the store without needing help from passers-by. It looked the same as it did 20 years ago. The sight of the familiar multicolored sign and the cloudy window displaying the counters, and a saleswoman in a blue apron made Janice grin. As soon as she entered the store, she was greeted by the familiar smell of fresh bread and perfume that the saleswoman, Mrs. Tyler, loved. "Mrs. Tyler, hello. Do you recognize me?" Janice asked. The woman hesitated. "Something seems familiar, but I can't remember." "I used to come here as a child," Janice explained. "Oh, Janice, how could I not recognize you?" Mrs. Tyler exclaimed, coming out from behind the counter. She hugged Janice and kissed her cheek. "You haven't been here for so long, and we haven't changed a thing, I've noticed. Can you sell me some groceries?" Janice asked, looking around the counters. "I need bread, milk, butter, vegetable oil, pasta, rice, peas, cheese, sugar, salt, and honey. Go to Mr. Leonard for the milk. He doesn't live far from here." "This milk," Mrs. Tyler nodded at the counter, "even a cat would be embarrassed to drink. It has a shelf life of 6 months. But he grows the tastiest tomatoes I've ever tasted. You should buy those too." Mrs. Tyler fell silent as a man burst into the store, dressed in dirty clothes with a serious expression on his face. He pushed Janice away from the counter and loudly demanded, "Mrs. Tyler, give me 2 bottles of mineral water and my order. A box with medicine and pest repellent." "Elliot, can't you see I have a visitor right now?" Mrs. Tyler asked sternly. Elliot glanced at Janice and waved his hand dismissively. "She's a city girl. If she needs it so badly, let her buy it in the city. But I need everything urgently." "Elliot," Mrs. Tyler looked at him sternly. Janice raised her hand in a consolatory gesture. "Let him go ahead, Mrs. Tyler. He seems to need it more." Mrs. Tyler grudgingly gave the man a glance and went off to fetch the box. "Couldn't it wait just a few minutes?" asked Janice. Meanwhile, the man was tall, with black hair and hands that showed signs of hard work. His gaze was stern. Janice hadn't seen men like him since she was a child. Despite his slightly unkempt appearance, Elliot was quite handsome and appeared to be in his 30s, but no older than 40. He looked at Janice, squinting. "Are you that principled?" the man asked gruffly. "I'm in no hurry to go anywhere, of course, but even in the city, people observe cues, and they are in a much bigger hurry than you." Janice grinned and turned away, feeling the piercing gaze of the man's brown eyes on her. Mrs. Tyler came out with a heavy box and held it out to Elliot. "Here you go. The mineral water is over there." She pointed to the far corner where plastic packages of mineral water were indeed located. "You can pay later." Elliot nodded, grabbed 2 bottles of mineral water, and left the store without saying goodbye. "Who was that?" Janice asked. Mrs. Tyler waved her hand and went to the shelf of cereals. "He's a local farmer. His father left him a small house and some livestock about 8 years ago. He decided to take the farm seriously and built it all himself. He hired workers and is doing the best he can. He has big plans, but so far he's only planted and sells food to our store in neighboring villages. He's not a bad man, but he's a bit rough. Nobody knows why." Janice picked up her bags of groceries and carried them home. They were heavy, and she barely made it, but the small refrigerator at home didn't look so poor now. Then the woman went to get vegetables and dairy products from the people Mrs. Tyler had recommended to her. Even though in the city, the girl was used to buying everything in the supermarket, in the village, it was common to buy from local people. Mr. Leonard lived really close to the store. He had a large yard and 2 goats. In the house, Janice found an elderly man making a chair. The woman explained the situation to him and introduced herself. "Janice," the elderly man smiled through his thick gray beard. "I'm so happy to know that you're Rita's granddaughter. I only remember her daughter." "Yes, that's my mother," the woman nodded. "So do you sell vegetables and milk?" About 20 minutes later, she came out with 3 huge bags that weighed twice as much as the previous ones. Apparently, Mr. Leonard decided to sell a month's supply of groceries in advance. Janice was uncomfortable to refuse, so she sacrificed her back, which barely bore the load. After walking only a dozen steps, Janice stopped, putting the bags on the ground. Suddenly, a black car with a large body stopped not far from her. Hearing a familiar voice, the woman looked up and saw Elliot. Janice hesitated. She didn't want to go with a man who didn't know how to be polite, but she didn't want to carry huge bags either, so she had to swallow her pride once again. "Yeah, I don't mind." Elliot got out of the car and picked up the bags. "Serious shopping, huh?" he said with a smile. "Are you going to winter here?" "No, I just arrived to make compote, fry some bio potatoes, and that's it," grinned the girl and picked up a smaller bag, helping to load it into the back. Elliot turned around and took the bag from her hands. Janice felt his warm touch and froze for a second. Elliot set the bag and closed the back of the truck. "Show me the way. Where do you live?" "Sure, I'll show you," Janice said, settling into the passenger seat. "So, you're coming to us from the city, right?" Elliot asked as he started the car. "Well, yes," Janice said thoughtfully. "And what attracted you here?" "I grew up here," Janice shrugged. "Now I had some problems at home, so I needed a place to be alone. I thought of my granny's house. I've always loved this village. It's quiet and peaceful, and there is nothing to interfere with thinking." "Yes, it is." Elliot was driving quickly, either because he was rushing or because it was his personal driving style. However, his fast pace wasn't limited to just driving. Whether in a store or on the street, he didn't slow down much, leading Janice to believe that it was a characteristic feature of his. Soon they drove up to Janice's house. The bags were unloaded and even carried into the house. Elliot walked through the waist-high grass, which had already begun to dry and rustled loudly underfoot. "Is there no one to cut it at all?" he asked. "Grandma did it herself almost until the day she died. She knew how to do everything from cutting and sewing to mowing and fixing the roof. But I'm just a city slob," she replied. "By the way, you're from the city, aren't you?" Janice asked. "Yes, yes," the man replied, glancing at his watch. "What time is it?" "I have to go now. I'm sorry." "I forgot to ask your name," Janice said. "The name's Elliot," he replied. "Nice to meet you, Elliot," Janice smiled. Elliot drove off, leaving Janice alone. She watched the departing car for a long time, trying to understand where this new acquaintance might lead. The next morning started with a rumble and a strange rustling sound. Janice, tossing and turning, got up from her creaking bed and went to the window. Outside, in the middle of a thicket of grass, she saw Elliot with an old scythe. The grass was neatly laid in even rows as Elliot moved, and it was obvious that he was sweating despite the cool morning weather. Janice opened the window and called out to Elliot. He looked back, stopped mowing, and took a deep breath, looking at the open window and the woman looking at him. Janice was wearing only a long linen dress that she had found in her closet and decided to use as a nightgown, having had no time yet to sort things out. "What are you doing?" she asked. Elliot raised his eyebrows, silently expressing his opinion of the silly question. "I realize you're mowing, but why are you doing it in my yard? Do you want me to stop?" Elliot asked, slightly sarcastically. Janice shook her head and closed the window, not wanting to continue the conversation any further. She also noticed the man's gaze clearly assessing her. To avoid repeating such situations, she changed her clothes and went to the small kitchen. Janice decided to make pancakes. Of course, she never got up so early and didn't usually cook anything. The fast city rhythm had accustomed her to skipping breakfast. But now she had to feed the unexpected assistant who decided to come to her house early in the morning to work. When Elliot finished, and it was clear from the sound of the scythe that he had stopped, the pancakes were already ready. Janice went out on the porch and called her unexpected assistant. "Will you come in for breakfast?" Elliot shrugged his shoulders, put aside his scythe, and went into the house. He was all sweaty and tired. "You can use the shower," Janice nodded toward the bathroom and went to the kitchen. Elliot washed his face and then came to the kitchen and sat down at the table. In front of him was a plate with pancakes and sour cream. Janice stood next to the table, folding her hands on her chest. "How much do I owe you?" she asked. Elliot raised his eyebrows. "Well, you didn't do it for free, did you?" For food, the man grinned and took a bite of his pancake. Leaning back in his chair, he looked directly into Janice's eyes as if trying to read something in them. "Well, since you don't want to accept payment, I won't insist," Janice shrugged. "I'm used to having to pay for any work." "Haven't you heard of the word help in the city?" Elliot asked. Janice snorted and laughed. "You said yourself you were from the city. Mrs. Tyler told me you've lived here for 8 years, so you can't blame me." "I'm not blaming you. It's just that city people are always surprised when they get help for nothing. I used to be like that too." "By the way, why aren't you eating?" Elliot asked. "I don't eat breakfast." Janice waved it off. "I always had to go to work early. I'm not used to it. I usually have a snack at work." "So what kind of work did you do?" Elliot asked, tilting his head and looking at Janice with interest. "Assistant to the CEO of a company." Elliot whistled. "Don't think I've been shoveling money with a child's scoop, but I enjoyed it. I was learning how to run a business, and I had a dream. And then, Elliot prompted. "Then I had a stroke," Janice snorted. "But I'll tell you that story later. I have to clean the house and the attic, besides I have a friend coming over tonight," Janice explained. "A busy life, you know," Elliot smiled in response. "I should get going too." The man finished his breakfast and left Janice's house. She watched him leave with a long look, trying to understand his motives. In the evening of the same day, Christina arrived again. She brought some things that Janice had asked for. Christina whistled when she saw the cleaned yard. She set the bags down and called out to her friend who was scrubbing the muddy windows. "I need to replace the glass. Where do you think I can find a handyman?" Janice asked without saying hello. Christina grinned. "Ask the man who mowed your plot." "Ah, that was Elliot, the local farmer. He gave me a ride yesterday. I don't think he has time for glass." Janice waved it off. "Well, he's already got time for grass." Christina shrugged. "What farmer?" Janice stopped rubbing the glass and invited her friend into the house. "If it's not too much trouble, peel the potatoes. They're under the sink." "I can't do anything anymore," Janice said tiredly, landing on a chair and wiping her forehead with the back of her palm. Christina took off her jacket and picked up the knife. "Now, tell me more about this farmer," she said with an enigmatic smile. "I didn't know him before he came here 8 years ago. My grandmother died around that time. He takes care of the farm, has different animals and vegetable gardens." "What else can I say about him? Is he rich?" Janice rebuked her. Christina was indignant. "It's crucial nowadays." "All right, but what is he like as a person to you?" Christina pressed. Janice hesitated. "I don't even know. He's kind of controversial. First, he insulted me at the store, and then he decided that giving me a ride was a good idea. So he also came this morning to mow the grass, even though I didn't ask him to, and then he refused to take money. Maybe he likes you," Christina teased. "Don't talk nonsense," Janice brushed it off. "He thinks I'm the town idiot." "Take a closer look at him. Maybe for once in your life, you'll have a normal man who knows he's a man," Christina encouraged. Janice rolled her eyes but said nothing in response. "How's work going?" Christina changed the subject. "Oh, don't ask. Without you, our boss has gone completely off the rails. He's already changed his third assistant. It turns out you've been doing more than he thought." Janice sighed. Having lived in the village for a month, Janice had gotten used to the small house and quiet life. Rest had also become a part of her routine, and it irritated her terribly. All her life, the woman had worked. She grew up in a not-so-wealthy family and started working right after finishing her studies. She never took days off for no particular reason and always arrived at work on time. And now, for almost a month, she had been doing almost nothing. During the first week, Janice spent her time cleaning the house and bringing it to a livable condition, but then came the silence and tranquility. The woman started waking up late, reading books brought by Christina, visiting her elderly neighbors, and listening to stories from their youth. In addition, Janice could not get rid of the thought that she was constantly meeting Elliot. The day Christina arrived, he heard the conversation about the glass and came to change it. The next morning, Janice fed him meat pie. Then he fixed the wicket. Again, she cooked him breakfast. It was like this several more times, and Janice was no longer surprised at the early rumbling outdoors and the presence of the man under the window. Elliot habitually came into the house and sat down at the table. There were hardly any long and weighty conversations between them. He didn't give her flowers, didn't compliment her, he just was there. For her, it seemed very strange. "Janice, you just come to eat at my place, right?" she finally confessed to Elliot one day. "I wouldn't say that," the man grinned, breaking away from the current topic. Most of their conversations were exactly like this, short, low-key, and usually humorous. There were rumors in the village, and some village women even came to Janice, threatening her. "Elliot is mine, do you understand?" menacingly pronounced a brunette with lush forms. "You think you came here from your city and you can grab our men? What a stupid you are." The stranger angrily tore a leaf off the tree and threw it at a dumbfounded Janice standing on the porch. When Elliot next came, she told him about his admirer. "Were you frightened?" grinned the man with a touch of seriousness in his words. "I ain't afraid of country broads. I was threatened by grown-up men when I worked in a big company. I once refused to sign a contract for my boss, and they almost cornered me right there, 5 grown men in suits, and I was alone. Now that's scary, not a leaf thrown by some crazy groupie of the man who, for some reason I don't know, fixes everything that breaks in my house." Elliot smiled and returned to his soup without saying another word. One day, Janice was walking around the village. Elliot hadn't come to her for a long time, and she assumed he was fed up. She went for a walk to unwind, deep down hoping to meet Elliot on the way. For some reason, she wanted to see him again. She had grown used to his strange silence that she almost missed him. Janice approached Mrs. Tyler, who came out of the store looking concerned. "Mrs. Tyler, something wrong?" "Yes, Elliot's farm is falling apart. There's some kind of trouble. Our men and women are all upset. They could be out of work, and where else can they find work in our village?" Mrs. Tyler lamented. "Oh no, trouble with Elliot. He's always barely kept afloat. Twisted his way out as best he could. But here, something has gone entirely wrong." Janice frowned and decided to visit Elliot. His farm was 2 kilometers from the village, a large, long building from which the mooing of cows could be heard. There were men in the backyard, and behind the farm were large vegetable fields, now empty in the middle of fall. Janice asked a passerby where Elliot's office was and went there. His office was small, one could even say quite tiny. In the middle, there was a table and a chair, a closet in the corner, and a small window in the wall through which a few crumbs of light penetrated. Elliot himself stood in the middle of the office, bent over papers, muttering something silently, counting on a calculator and making edits to the documents. Janice approached and said, "Hello." The man turned around abruptly and let out a sigh. "Is something broken again?" he asked. "No," Janice replied. "I heard you were in trouble, so I came to help." "Is it something with the paperwork?" "It's okay, I can handle it," Elliot said harshly. She stepped closer and almost pushed Elliot away, reaching for the papers. The man said loudly, "Go away, or I'll have to drag you out of here by force." Janice raised her eyebrows and took a closer look at the papers in Elliot's hands. With just a glance, she could see the huge sums in excessive spending, which were unnecessary for a place this small compared to the city. "Do you even have an accountant or a financial expert?" Janice asked. "I'm doing quite well on my own," Elliot repeated. "I can see how well, managing a fabulous spending spree to nowhere. You urgently need a specialist." "And where am I going to get one?" Elliot asked glumly. Janice smiled broadly and pointed at herself. "I have a degree in economics, plus I'd worked for several years at a company where the costs and revenues were much higher than yours." Elliot waved his hand and sat down tiredly on a chair, leaving Janice with the papers. Late in the afternoon, when it was already dark, Elliot and Janice left his office. The farm was empty. The workers had cleaned up and closed everything down. "Why do you need both cow drums and milk delivery 3 times a day? One is enough. It will keep in the fridge, Janice pointed out. There's no point in driving cars and spending so much money on it. Many of the costs are like that. The budgeting is very inept. Elliot scratched the back of his head in confusion. I was actually in the military. Accounting estimates are far from my expertise. My father always dreamed of having his own big farm and fields, but I decided to fulfill his dream, even if it's a bit late. Janice looked sympathetically at Elliot as they walked down the narrow path. It was cool outside, the wind blowing, but she felt perfectly calm and quiet. So, what's the story about the stroke? Elliot suddenly asked. Janice flinched. At first, she wanted to brush it off with a joke, but then she remembered that she had promised to tell him. Letting out a deep breath, she began her story. That's when I came up with that plan, Janice remembered, recalling the conversation with the detective. Christina helped me put it into action. She found a doctor who, for a fee, agreed to tell my husband that I was in intensive care because of a stroke and that I couldn't be visited. After 2 weeks, the doctor sadly informed my husband that it was impossible to help me and that I would soon die. He discharged me to live out my last days among my family. While I was supposedly in the hospital, my husband called only twice. When I came home in a wheelchair, I was forgotten and unwanted. That's when he came up with the idea of bringing me here so I could die faster. But I just thought that if my husband saw me at death's door, he might finally remember that he really loves me, call off his mistress, and start taking care of me, do something to help me live as long as possible. But I was cruelly mistaken. Elliot took Janice's hand and squeezed it tightly. She looked at the palm he was clutching and nodded in gratitude for the support. Why don't you go back to the city? Elliot asked. At first, I wanted to take it easy and wait it out for a while. But then I realized I didn't want to go back there yet. The fast pace, always running around, it's another reminder of Frank and his mom, Janice replied. Elliot let go of her hand and quickened his pace. Let's go. I'll show you something. They walked for a long time, and Janice didn't know where they were heading. But when they arrived, she exclaimed in surprise. Elliot had led her to a huge fancy house with a high fence. This is the house of an acquaintance of mine. We served together. He recently died of cancer, and now they're selling it, Elliot explained. I wish I could buy it back, but I don't have the money. They're going to buy the house and tear it down to build some kind of sawmill or something. Do you realize that if you buy this house, there's no turning back? Janice asked. I don't want to go back to the city. I'm too impatient and fast for the country but too slow for the city. It's a paradox. I can succeed here and I can't succeed there, Elliot admitted. Janice fixed her gaze on Elliot's stern face, his hopeful eyes, tightly compressed lips, and the wrinkles on his forehead that appeared when he was deep in thought. A determined light flashed in Janice's eyes. She squeezed Elliot's hand, mirroring his earlier gesture, and smiled. You're destined for success. I'll help you. Together, we'll bring the farm to life, just as your father dreamed. I promise, Janice assured him. Elliot said nothing, but hope shone in his eyes, and he believed in the best. Elliot and Janice began working together, and she assisted him in improving the farm. They invested in new cattle and equipment, and soon, profit began to appear not only on paper. Elliot was overjoyed. As a token of gratitude, he frequently gave Janice flowers. The tradition of fixing up Janice's house was revived, with Elliot visiting almost every morning and her preparing breakfast. It became a cherished ritual. A few weeks later, Christina visited Janice's house and brought the papers. Are you sure? Christina asked her friend. More than sure, Janice replied, taking hold of the folder. There's no turning back. Christina echoed Janice's words, understanding the significance of their journey together. I know, and I'm willing to take the risk. Christina remained silent, choosing not to argue with her friend. After all they had been through, she was determined to support Janice in any endeavor. Clutching the documents to her chest, Janice made her way to the farm. Today, equipment was arriving, so she hurried as much as she could. Furthermore, she had exciting news to share. As usual, Janice found Elliot in his office, sitting at the table and engrossed in writing. Upon seeing her, he smiled and radiated happiness. "You're early," he said, pulling out a chair for Janice. The woman sat down at the table and put the papers down. "Read it," Janice urged. Elliot took the folder and began to leaf through the papers. His eyes grew wider with each page. Janice watched his reaction with hidden fear and anticipation. Closing the folder, Elliot set it aside on the table and lowered his eyes to Janice. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. "Did you buy a house?" Janice nodded and got up from her chair. She stood directly in front of him, looking straight into his eyes. "You didn't want it torn down. It was your friend's house, and I promised you it would work out." "But that's a lot of money," Elliot exhaled. "It's my money. I can do whatever I want with it. Besides, I like the village." Janice's train of thought was interrupted by a kiss. "Is that how you decided to get the house?" Janice grinned as Elliot pulled away. "Is that what you think of me?" he asked hoarsely. "No, I was kidding," Janice exhaled. "I bought this house for us. If you want us to be together, I think I'm in love." The man kissed her again. "Me too," he replied, hugging Janice gently. Hearing all this, Frank couldn't believe it. His hands were resting on his knees, and his eyes stared straight ahead in bewilderment. "Are you telling me you made all this up to test me?" Janice looked at him sadly and sipped her tea. There was a knock on the door. Christina walked in wearing a tight blue dress. She looked directly at Frank and grinned. "Well, did you tell him everything?" "Too bad I couldn't see his face. I was a little late." "So you know everything?" Frank bellowed. Christina grinned. "That was my doctor. The one I paid for the diagnosis. Did you really think Janice pulled all this off by herself? She loved you too much to do it, and you broke her heart. Decided you could treat her like garbage." Frank pressed his lips together. "You don't understand anything, Janice. I love you." Janice raised her eyebrows, grinning. "Does Aisha suit you anymore? Or maybe she couldn't wait for you to open your own business and shower her with gifts." Frank opened his mouth to object but stopped himself, realizing that excuses were pointless. "But how dare you play such a trick with Mom? She was so upset when she found out you were sick." Christina and Janice exchanged looks and laughed. Mrs. Pickles ran ahead of everyone and joyfully shouted that her daughter-in-law was ill and would soon die. "She was even more interested in my inheritance than you." Frank surveyed the house, then smiled broadly. "So you bought and earned all of this while you were married to me?" Christina frowned, understanding what Frank was implying. She wanted to argue, but he spoke again. "And since you acquired all of this during our marriage, half of the property is mine, right?" Christina, being a lawyer, knew the law and how such situations usually ended. Janice stood up from her chair and glared angrily at her husband, wanting to say everything she thought about him. However, at that moment, the door opened and Elliot walked in. "Hi, dear," Janice nodded and whispered something in the man's ear. He turned towards Frank with a serious and furious expression. It seemed almost impossible to stop him as he loomed over Frank. Frank swallowed in fear and began to back away, looking for an escape route. "If you dare to threaten Janice again, I'll make your life a living hell," Elliot said roughly, grabbing Frank by the scruff of his neck and throwing him out of the room. Christina, Janice, and Elliot heard the front door slam as Frank quickly moved away from the house. "Why did you let him in?" Elliot asked Janice, stepping closer and hugging her from behind. In front of Frank, she held herself back, not wanting to show weakness, though everyone in the room knew how much she had suffered from his betrayal. Janice stood there, head low, fighting back the urge to cry. "I should have told him everything," she uttered. "I should have seen the look on his face when he realized that my inheritance and I were out of his reach." "Did it make you feel better?" Christina asked. Janice nodded and wrapped herself more tightly in Elliot's strong and reliable embrace. "I'll file for divorce tomorrow." Despite Elliot's threats, Frank still decided to file for divorce and divide the property. The court notice arrived at the post office, and Elliot brought it along with the rest of his documents, grimly handing it to Janice. When she opened the envelope and read the summons, her face turned pale. She hadn't thought Frank would actually sue to divide the property, just as she hadn't thought he would abandon her to die. He was a very unpredictable man. "We need a good lawyer," said Elliot, picking up the notices. "Christina," Janice said. "She heads the legal department of the firm. She has a license to handle cases. I think she can help us." Elliot sat down next to Christina and said, "Listen, I looked into the bathroom after you yesterday and found a test in there. Are you pregnant?" Janice nodded. "I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd mind." A soft kiss interrupted her. Elliot put his arms around her and smiled broadly. "Better than any words," he said. He hugged his beloved tightly and pulled her against him. "If that rascal suddenly decides to sue you for half of your property, I don't care. You and I won't be left with nothing. We'll have our house, our farm, the baby, and ourselves. We'll have each other." Janice closed her eyes and sighed deeply. When she opened them, Elliot saw the determined and unwavering look that had once frightened the detective. "If he goes to court to take from me what is mine by blood, he'll leave with nothing. I'll take not only mine but everything he has. He'll be left with nothing." The trial took place very soon, as if the universe itself wanted to end this strange case quickly. Christina became Janice's lawyer, and Elliot supported her from the witness bench, along with many of the villagers. The judge listened to the plaintiff's statement with boredom, asking clarifying questions to which he could not always provide answers. The plaintiff's witnesses included his mother, neighbors, and friends who all spoke negatively about Janice. Mrs. Pickles displayed all her dramatics. "I was so scared when she had her stroke. I didn't sleep for 3 nights waiting for news from the hospital." Tears flowed from the woman's eyes as she wiped them with a white handkerchief. "And when I saw Janice, I almost had a heart attack myself. She didn't move, she was almost inanimate. I had to take care of her while Frank was working. I cleaned her, fed her, and she wasn't sick. The worst thing I could ever experience had already happened to me. My son and I have been betrayed, deceived, and now they want to leave me with nothing." Mrs. Pickles gave another sob and sat back down on the bench. "Your Honor, you shouldn't take the word of the plaintiff and his witnesses at face value. To begin with, the defendant has evidence of the plaintiff's adultery. The recording is admitted into evidence. The recording of Janice and Frank's conversation played in the courtroom. A detective then took the witness stand to talk about the plaintiff's love affairs and lies." Mrs. Pickles jumped up from the bench but sat back down after the judge's warning. She seemed deeply distressed by the slander. "I would also like to point out that the defendant did not deceive the plaintiff with medical documentation," Christina continued. "She only pretended to be ill to test him. No certificates were provided. The doctor merely mentioned the diagnosis to the plaintiff and his mother without verifying it. Additionally, the plaintiff claims that she took care of the sick defendant." Christina's defense continued strongly, challenging each accusation with evidence and reasoned arguments. "I have a recording of a conversation between Mrs. Pickles and her son. Please play it," Christina announced firmly. The recording began with Mrs. Pickles' voice. "Yes, Sonny, feed her." "Oh, I was reading, I completely forgot. But it's all right, she'll be fine anyway, she won't lose weight. What's up? You found a nurse for her? Good. The main thing is that she doesn't cost much. And the fact that she drinks, it's no big deal. The doctor said Janice won't last long anyway." The conversation abruptly ended, and Christina resumed her argument. In addition, the plaintiff filed a petition for the division of the residence in the village, which had indeed been purchased by the defendant. However, the defendant has already terminated her marital relationship with the plaintiff. They were living separately. Besides, the money used to purchase the house was from her inheritance and was transferred from an account opened in her name by her grandmother. Therefore, the plaintiff cannot claim partition of this house. The remaining money in the defendant's account, as well as the share in the estate in Germany, are part of the inheritance to which the plaintiff is also not entitled. The judge grinned almost imperceptibly, but Janice was ready to swear that she looked at Frank with a hint of joy. The plaintiff's claim was seeking an equal division of property between the former spouses. However, it is not only the defendant's property but also the property of the plaintiff himself, namely, a 3-room apartment, a BMW car, and money in the joint account of the plaintiff and the defendant. Objection. Frank's lawyer, a bald man with round glasses, jumped up from his seat. The apartment is the plaintiff's inheritance from his father. True, Christina nodded, but according to the law, if one spouse has made substantial changes to the property of the other spouse, it can be recognized as joint. What substantial changes were made? The attorney asked. Now, on the screen, Your Honor, you will see pictures of the apartment before it was renovated. As you can see, it was in terrible condition. These pictures were taken exactly 1 year after the plaintiff and defendant were married. And here are pictures of the apartment after it was renovated another 6 months later. How do you prove that this was done with the defendant's money? First, during the renovation period, the plaintiff was not working, and according to the bank statement, his personal account did not have the necessary amount of money. Additionally, we have the testimony of the foreman of the team that did the repairs. The contract was made on behalf of the defendant. The defense lawyers argued for a long time, calling witnesses and trying to prove their point. But soon, the judge left and returned with a large red file. For sentencing, the court has ruled to grant the plaintiff's claim. 1/3 of the apartment goes to the defendant, the automobile goes to joint use, and 50% of the money from the plaintiff's account goes to the defendant. The judgment has been rendered and is not subject to appeal. The bang of the gavel resolved everything. Frank and his mother looked at Janice with anger and hatred while she was embraced by Elliot. Christina, smiling broadly, joined them. "I told you we'd take everything from him," she said in a slightly strange, even possessed voice. "It's rightfully yours." Elliot exhaled. "Not his, but yours. Do you understand now? You and I have everything we've ever dreamed of." The man smiled. "It remains to have a child, and the happiness will be complete." "Will you take me as godmother?" Christina asked. "Do we have a choice?" Elliot replied. "None." Janice smiled and hugged the two dearest people in her life. Now she would definitely be fine.